Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to do an update on a presentation we've done before on wildlife in winter. Winter is approaching here at Eastman. And yes, some of the wildlife may have migrated away, but winter is actually a pretty good time to see signs of our wildlife. There are lots of animals that remain active during winter. That includes moose, deer, bobcats, fishers, beavers, rabbits and hares, barred owls, foxes, skunks, coyotes, otters, and many others. Actually, a fresh snowfall is a great time to go out and look for animal tracks. But keep in mind that sometimes the tracks get distorted in the snow, particularly as there's some melting. The tracks you're most likely to see at Eastman in the snow are dogs, followed by rabbits and hares and squirrels. But you may also see bear tracks, bobcat tracks, tracks of foxes, coyotes, raccoons, fishers, weasels, otters, porcupines, deer, moose, wild turkeys, and many others. So again, animals basically have three basic strategies for winter. They can either migrate to a warmer area, hibernate or sleep and reduce their metabolism, or stay awake and remain active. So again, strategy number one is moving to a warmer area. And many bird species and bat species actually migrate south in the winter. Monarch butterflies fly to Mexico for the winter. Strategy number two is reducing metabolism and activity. True hibernation means going to sleep and reducing your metabolism and activity to a bare minimum. And bats and groundhogs are true hibernators. There are very few other true hibernators, but there are lesser degrees of reducing metabolism and activity. We'll talk about what we call torpor in a minute. So again, the third strategy is staying awake and active. So moose stay active all winter, but they do reduce their activity, whereas they have a typical range of about 25 square miles or more in the summer. They may reduce that range to less than a square mile in winter. So regardless of which of the three strategies that are taken, animals have to prepare for winter earlier. If birds or bats are migrating, they have to store up enough energy for the flight. A bear develops hyperphagia in the fall and fattens up, so there are enough fat stores to get it through the winter. Groundhogs actually double their weight prior to winter because they go through winter without eating at all. And fortunately, many high energy foods like acorns and beech nuts become available in the fall, which is the time the animals need to store up these resources. Squirrels cache their nuts for winter in their nests. Some of them actually cache them in multiple sites as kind of insurance in case something happens to one site. Blue jays also cache nuts, often far from where they find them. Chipmunks cache food in what are called larders in their burrows. And beavers cache sticks for food at the entrances to their lodges, basically underwater at the entrance to the lodge. And it's not just squirrels that cache nuts. Here's a red-headed woodpecker getting ready for winter, and he's actually storing a nut. And again, we already mentioned that blue jays are also known for caching nuts. So again, some animals change fur color to make it easier to hide in the snow. This would include weasels and snowshoe hares. Many animals molt and grow new hair that's denser than the previous hair and has more hollow hairs that provide some insulation. Some animals grow fur on their feet, for instance, lynx and snowshoe hares, or grow extensions on their feet, such as ruffed grouse do. And this is something that can help them walk on top of the snow in winter. Even birds grow new feathers and fluff out their feathers to create some air pockets that creates insulation to help keep them warm. And body oils that are produced by some various glands produce waterproofing of skin and fur. And animals that do this include beavers, deer, and many birds. So again, finding suitable shelter is most important for winter. Some animals already have burrows that they can winter in. This would include groundhogs, chipmunks, skunks. Beavers build their lodges to spend the winter in. Bats find caves or mines to hibernate in. Porcupines like to den in hollow trees. Bears, bobcats, and others tend to make their dens in rocky crags or hollow logs or root masses. And mice and many small mammals find holes in the ground, but they can also use subnivean tunnels. We'll talk about the subnivean zone later on, but the snow actually produces or provides some warmth for them. And turtles and frogs find water deep enough so that the ice doesn't reach them, and then they dig into the mud, spend the winter there. A few frogs actually totally freeze in winter, yet they still live. Snakes also huddle together in hibernacula in the winter. So again, rocky dens often provide shelter. The top shows a bobcat in a rocky den. The bottom shows a the black bear den cave here in New Hampshire. And both bobcats and black bears can also den in hollow logs or root masses and other things. We mentioned color changes in winter. Again, some animals like weasels and snowshoe hares do change their color of their fur in the winter. And they go from brown coats to completely white, except the weasel usually maintains a black tip to the tail. And it's not the temperature or the snow that triggers this change in fur color. It's decreasing amounts of daylight in late fall that trigger hormonal reactions that cause the production of natural pigments in their bodies. And reduced daylight causes a chemical reaction that decreases levels of dark melanin containing pigments. And being able to blend into the snow in winter is certainly an asset. But if you become white when there's no snow, you're actually much more easily seen. This is showing a weasel. Again, the top is a long-tailed weasel in the summer. Again, it's got a brown coat with a yellow underbelly and a long tail with a black tip. This is the same weasel in the winter. And again, now he's completely white except for this tip of the tail, which remains black. And the white coat helps protect them from predators, but it also hides them from the prey that they're looking for. Again, snowshoe hares. Again, here's one in the summer with the brownish gray fur. And in the winter, it's basically all white. So again, it's well camouflaged against the snow. And that white fur helps hide them from predators. Other things are camouflaged well. Barred owls blend in well with their surroundings almost any time of year. Here's a barred owl in winter, and they sit so still that it's very easy to miss them. So if we have trouble seeing them, imagine what a small mammal like a mouse would be missing. So other coat changes that happen, again, the fur of the feathers typically thicken and develop ways to trap air, which provides further insulation. And many mammals have what we call guard hairs as the outer layer of their coats, and this protects their skin and their undercoat. And the guard hairs are typically hollow in many mammals and filled with air. And that provides them with both insulation and some buoyancy in case they go in the water. And many mammals also waterproof their skin and their fur with oils from various glands. And the fur on the feet of some mammals, such as Canada lynx and snowshoe hares, actually increases and helps them be able to walk on top of the snow. As we mentioned before, many birds grow extra feathers as part of their late fall molt, and this gives them thicker protection in winter. And the oil that coats birds' feathers also provides insulation as well as some waterproofing. And the birds also tend to fluff out their feathers and create air pockets for additional insulation when it's particularly cold. And this may make them look fat and puffy. So again, we mentioned guard hairs. This is often in the outer layer of the coats of various animals, and this protects their skin and their undercoat. And it protects the undercoat from abrasion, moisture, and even from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. And it also helps them maintain body temperature and can reduce the severity of any cuts or scratches. The guard hairs typically are longer and have a larger diameter than those of the undercoat. And they're usually straight and protrude through the undercoat. And they're often shiny, and that often produces a characteristic color pattern that gives the animal its visible coloring or even a luster to their coat. And in many mammals, the guard hairs are hollow and they're filled with airs. And as we mentioned, this provides both insulation and helps make them buoyant when they're in water. Birds in winter, again, they tend to fluff out their feathers to create some air pockets, which produces additional insulation. And this can make them look fat and puffy. And they may also tuck their legs or beak into the feathers in order to reduce some heat loss. And it's very interesting that they also have a special vascular system with a what we call a counter current that exchanges heat. So what happens is that it cools the blood that's going to their feet. So in fact, their feet don't get stuck on icy surfaces, don't freeze to the branches, for instance. But it also warms the blood that's returning from their feet so that it helps maintain some heat. So very interesting what the birds do. Many animals also huddle together in winter. This is characteristic of beavers, deer, bats, chickadees, snakes, and rarely a member of a different species may even join them. In our many talks on beavers, we've mentioned that sometimes a muskrat may actually join the beavers in a beaver lodge and huddle with them to help keep them all warm. And shivering also generates heat. Just like we shiver when we get cold, mammals and even birds can shiver to generate heat. Winter is also a time for breeding. Many animals breed during the winter: beavers, bobcats, skunks, coyotes, raccoons, owls. Many mammals have also mated earlier, but have what we call delayed implantation of the blastocyte. And so they undergo gestation during the winter and may give birth during the winter. And this is characteristic of bears and river otters. We mentioned strategy number 2, which is reducing metabolism and activity. Well, true hibernation means going to sleep and reducing your metabolism and activity to a bare minimum. And there are very few species that are true hibernators. Groundhogs, bats, wood frogs, and snakes are the primary ones that are true hibernators. But there are lesser levels of reducing metabolism and activity. So again, what is hibernation? Again, it's basically shutting down your metabolism to an absolute minimum. And you have to survive on the caloric stores that were built up during the fall. So, for example, here's what bats do. They drop their body temperature from almost 100 degrees down to 35 to 41 degrees. They drop their heart rate from 200 to 300 beats per minute down to just 10 beats per minute. And they drop their breathing rate down to one breath every 15 minutes. So very few animals we mentioned are true hibernators. And many more are more likely to go into a lighter sleep-like state, which we call a torpor. And they reduce their metabolism and activity, but they're still arousable. So groundhogs are true hibernators. Groundhogs' metabolism slows usually in early June. And even though their food intake decreases, their weight actually increases by as much as 100%. And they deposit fats to sustain them for the hibernation and long winter. And instead of storing foods, groundhogs basically just stuff themselves in order to survive the winter without eating. So groundhogs, again, are true hibernators. Their temperature drops down to 37 degrees. Their heartbeat slows from 80 beats per minute to just 5 beats per minute. Their breathing rate slows to as few as 2 breaths per minute. And their metabolic rate also slows. So they end up losing 25 to 50% of their weight over the winter. And yes, when they do emerge from hibernation in February, it's only a myth that they can predict spring. So how about bats in winter? Bats have 2 options in winter. They can either migrate, and 3 of New Hampshire's bat species do migrate south in the winter, or they can hibernate. And 5 of New Hampshire bat species do hibernate in winter, and they hibernate from November through April. Some males have a hybrid approach where they go a little bit south and then migrate, particularly in mines. And this is showing bats hibernating. Notice how they hibernate together. That it helps maintain some heat. Uh, Again, they hibernate in either caves or mines. They severely shut down their metabolism. Remember, we said their body temperature drops down to 35 to 41 degrees, heart rate down to 10 beats per minute, and breathing rate down to one breath every 15 minutes. But to prepare for hibernation, they have to increase their body weight by about 25% during the fall. But they have a very narrow margin of error. If they actually gain more than 25% of weight, they actually can't fly. So again, very narrow margin of error. And again, there are two types of hibernators, cave hibernators and mine hibernators. New Hampshire bats are mainly cave hibernators. The hibernacula has a very stable temperature, usually between 40 and 50 degrees, and the humidity is usually over 80%. And these conditions actually protect the bats from freezing or getting dehydrated during their long months in winter. And the mine hibernators usually migrate someplace else. Uh, One problem with the bats during hibernation is what's called white nose syndrome. It's killing many bats around the world, and it's caused indirectly by a fungus. Here you can see the fungus that's around the nose of the bat. And actually, what happens is the irritation from that fungus wakes the bats up from hibernation. And when they wake up, all those things that we talked about that basically shut down their metabolism are now reactivated, and they use up all their resources, their reserves. So again, even though it's caused by a fungus, the fungus doesn't directly kill them. Basically, they had shut down their metabolic activity, but the irritation wakes them up. That increases their temperature, their heart rate, and their metabolism. And that causes them to use up their fat reserves, and they actually end up starving before spring arrives. So that shows just how fragile the hibernation state really is. How about bears in winter? Well, we often talk about bears as hibernating. They're not true hibernators, but they have to get ready for winter by eating as much food as possible. So during the fall months, they basically eat and drink almost nonstop. We refer to that process as hyperphagia, and they need to be able to put on weight to prepare for winter. The bears do den up in winter. Their dens can be in hollow trees or logs, under the root ball of a tree, in rock crevices, or in caves. And once again, they're not true hibernators. Rather, they go into this deep like sleep that we call a torpor, and that conserves energy. So the misnomer hibernation for bears simply means they don't eat or drink, and they rarely urinate or defecate. And during their slumber, their body temperatures will drop. Also, their heart rate and respiratory rate will drop. And their bodies will use up the fat that they stored up during the summer and fall. And they'll end up losing about 25% of their weight over the winter. But the main difference between hibernation and torpor is that during torpor, the bear is able to wake up quickly and avoid danger. Or if the opportunity exists, they can go outside the den and find some food. So, in fact, during winter, you may actually might see some bears. And this is a fat bear week in 2025. That was actually a grizzly bear out west. Well, here in New Hampshire, we have only black bears. Back in 2022, the food sources were less than usual, and our black bears weren't putting on a lot of weight that they usually gain prior to winter. But in subsequent, what we call mast years, where we had abundant acorns and beech nuts, the bears have had a lot of food in the forest to be able to bulk up for the winter. And this year, it seems like we're seeing a lot of acorns out in the forest. So we expect our black bears are going to be able to put on the weight that they need for the upcoming winter. So again, hibernation is really triggered by decreasing day length, and that creates some hormonal changes in animals that dictates that they need to start to conserve energy. And pregnant bears give birth to their cubs in the den, usually during the first 2 months of hibernation. And the family remains in that den for the duration of winter while the mom is sleeping and the cubs are nursing and beginning to grow. And they emerge in the spring when the snow begins to melt, and then they have to start searching for food. They often first search in the wetlands, which tend to have some of the earliest food sources. This is showing black bear den in a cave, and this is showing one in a tree. Here, the mama bear and the cubs are denning in the hollow of a tree in winter. And again, they're not true hibernators, so you may actually see them in the winter. And this video was courtesy of Mark Kendall. So here you see the mama bear up top, and you're seeing a couple cubs down below. Yeah, there actually may be 3 cubs in there. So bear tracks you may see in the snow in the winter. Bears have 5 toes and wide palm pads. The top shows the hind paw with a huge heel print. Again, here in this diagram, the hind paw is up here and the front paw is back here. And the front paw has shorter claws and the toes are slightly more separated. And the heel pad on the front foot is barely showing. You can just see a little bit right here. Sometimes it doesn't show at all. Climate change has impacted the bears, particularly here in New Hampshire and New England, and that's because our winters are getting shorter. They start later and they end earlier. We have more snow cover free days in recent years. So bears have been out and about more in recent years in winter. And that's why we recommend you not put your bird feeders out until there's been snow on the ground for a while. The old recommendation used to be take your bird feeders down between April 1st and December 1st. Um, and that was because the bears are usually active during that time. But in fact, with shorter winters, you need to take the bear activity into account when you decide about your bird feeders. So in fact, you may need to put them out later than December 1st and take them in before April 1st. How about bobcats? Bobcats are on the prowl year round, and their coat becomes a lighter gray in the winter, and that tends to blend in with some of the bare plants in winter. So they're actually pretty well camouflaged from their prey. And they don't mind the snow, but they don't particularly like really deep snow. So if it's a heavy snowstorm, they may stay in their shelters. Canada lynx, on the other hand, have larger padded feet that actually help them walk on top of the snow more easily than the bobcat can. So again, if you have lynx in an area, that actually puts the bobcats at somewhat of a disadvantage. A bobcat's breeding season is typically from mid-January to early February. Once again, they are active. Here's a video of a bobcat here in New Hampshire at Eastman, courtesy of Amy Hoffman. And watch a few things. First, you'll see the bobcat sitting on its haunches, then a very slow, stealthy gait. Notice the paw placement. And you'll probably see he was probably hunting under a bird feeder. So here he's on his haunches, he or she. I can't tell whether this is a male or a female. Okay, getting up, very slow, stealthy walk. There you see a bird feeder up top. Bobcats tend to go under bird feeders, not because they eat the bird seed, but they're looking for the small animals that might be under that bird feeder. That's a typical bobcat looking for hunting. Okay, here's the second part of that video, and what you're going to see here is the bobcat both sniffing some scent and leaving some scent. So he or she is going back now. He's going to stop there, do some sniffing. And then it's going to turn around and it's going to leave some scent of its own. Okay, pretty amazing video. Bobcats especially like to hang around stone walls. And the reason they do that is that many small mammals, which are their favorite prey, also inhabit those stone wall areas. So they can also use those stone walls as elevated corridors when they're hunting. They also like to walk on top of fallen logs. And particularly here, look at how the gray coat blends in both with the stone wall and with the leafless branches. So again, that's a good camouflage for the bobcat in winter. So where do bobcats den? Well, they do make dens for breeding, for storing food, for protection from predators, and protection from the weather. And those dens are also for rest, sleep, and play. And they especially like to make their living place in rock formations and caves. But they can also den in a hollow tree or a log or a brush pile. And often they have multiple dens. And once again, here's one in their favorite place, which is in a rocky crevice. And again, this protects them both from predators and for adverse weather conditions. So bobcat tracks in the snow, they're like most feline tracks. They usually don't show claws, and that's because felines usually have retractable claws. So here you see a nice print, and you're really not seeing any claw marks. Note there are three lobes on the bottom of the heel print, and that's characteristic of a feline track as opposed to a canine track, which usually only has two lobes. And again, notice in the bottom one, there seems to be a halo around the print. And that's because they have a lot of fur, and the fur is actually producing the halo pattern. Bobcat track patterns. This is one that was actually left in my backyard by a bobcat. And you'll notice here, these are the bobcat tracks. It looks like it's in a straight line, almost a linear pattern. And that's because they walk by what we call direct registration. And that's where the hind foot actually lands directly on top of where the front foot went. So again, that's direct registration. You may also see a bobcat sit down. So again, look at the bobcat up here sitting on its haunches. And you can predict what a sit down would look like in the snow. So again, here you see where he's sitting down. You see the two back paws here, kind of a mark from where the haunches were, and then one for each of the front paws. So that's a bobcat sit down. Okay, squirrels in winter. Well, you all see the squirrels fattening up prior to winter. And in the winter, they spend more time in their nests or their dens. Cavity nests provide more shelter from the elements than platform nests. Remember, squirrels have two types of nests. A platform nest would be kind of up on a tree branch or in the crotch of a tree. And cavity nests are ones where there's actually a hole in the tree. And the cavity nests actually provide more shelter. And the squirrels may huddle together in those nests to generate heat, and they also generate heat by shivering. And on days when it's below freezing, they may actually just sleep in their nests, and they'll lower their heart rate and temperature and breathing, but not to the point of hibernation. And they've cached lots of nuts for the winter, so don't have to spend as much time outside foraging. And remember, gray squirrels tend to have multiple caches, so they have some insurance if something happens to one cache. And that's different from red squirrels, which tend to have a single cache. So you may often see squirrels near your bird feeders in the winter. And here's a cavity nest, multiple squirrels in there. Again, they prefer live trees for their cavity nests. And a tree cavity den sometimes is first created by a woodpecker or abandoned by that bird, and then later claimed by the squirrel. Or there may be natural processes that can hollow out a tree. This was probably a natural cavity in the tree. And tree cavity nests, again, offer the best protection from wind, rain, and snow. Squirrel tracks are common in the winter, and it's often hard to distinguish them from rabbit tracks. They certainly are comparable. But the big difference here is that squirrel tracks, which are here on the right, the front paws, which are in the back here, actually are side by side, where in the hare tracks, what you'll see is the front paws are a little bit offset. So that's the main way to see the difference between the two. And again, this is just showing some gray squirrel tracks in the snow. How about chipmunks? Well, chipmunks live year round in their very extensive burrows. Again, they cache their foods in a larder in their burrows, but they may also do some scatter hoarding. They usually don't really hibernate, but they go into a state of torpor and they'll remain in their nests until spring. And their sleeping quarters are kept clear of shells, and their feces are stored in special tunnels called refuge tunnels. This is showing a diagram of chipmunk burrow. They're very elaborate structures. They can be anywhere from 10 to 30 feet long, and they have multiple entrances and exits, which are often disguised. So here you see three actual entrances, and they cache food in a larder. Okay, so they're caching food here, and there's a chamber for sleeping, and they also have separate chamber for disposing of waste. So again, very incredible, elaborate structures. How about rabbits in winters? Well, rabbits and hares are active all winter long, and they shelter in underground dens, and they'll insulate them with grass, straw, and twigs. And you actually may see them more, maybe more likely to see them in winter because they have to spend more time outside looking for food. They need to find some tall plants that rise above the snow in order for them to eat. And rabbits and hare tracks are probably the most common tracks you're going to see at Eastman, other than dog tracks. And we already mentioned how the snowshoe hare's coat turns white in winter, which helps protect them from predators. But cottontail rabbits stay brown, so they have to hang out near thick bushes, or evergreen trees, or solid fences. So anything else that predators can't see through in order to stay safe. And snowshoe hares actually grow a lot more fur on their paws during winter. And again, this allows them to walk on top of the snow. So once again, probably the two most common tracks you'll see, aside from dog tracks in the snow, are actually made by squirrels and hares. And again, here you're seeing hare tracks, and once again, the front feet, which typically show up behind the rear feet, are slightly offset, and that's what differentiates them from squirrel tracks. But keep in mind that as the snow melts, the classic image of these tracks often becomes obscured. And I can't tell you how many times we're surprised when we're out following a track and we're expecting a different animal. We finally find out it was actually a hare that created the tracks. How about foxes in winter? Well, red foxes may den in winter, but often they just curl up out in the open. They wrap their tail around themselves, tuck in their noses, and basically rest or go to sleep. Real cold nights, they may go into a den or create a new den. It, red foxes have this uncanny ability to find prey beneath the snow. They have a very keen sense of hearing to help them locate the prey. And they also use the Earth's geomagnetic field to help them hunt. Many of their leaps in the snow come up empty, but when they're facing north or slightly northeast, they actually catch prey 75% of the time. That's an incredible statistic. And we're going to look at this video. Incredible. That leap resulted in him catching a mouse that was probably three feet under the snow. And so again, you may want to go look at our presentation on red foxes to learn a little bit more about how they do that. Well, coyotes are also active year round. They don't hibernate. You're actually more likely to hear them than to see them. And that's really not just in winter, it's anytime you're more likely to hear coyotes than see them. And they communicate by vocalizing, by scent marking, and through a variety of body displays. They howl to locate their pups or advertise for a mate or warn intruders to stay out of their territory. And they mate from January to early March. This is something, though, you may see in the snow. Even though they mate from January to early March, during the pre-estrus period, which is usually begins in about mid-December, they may urinate. The female will urinate and leave a little bit of blood-tinged urine in the snow. So again, if you see that, it's a reliable sign that there was a female coyote there. The coyotes are also quite vocal during mating season. How about skunks? Well, skunks are not true hibernators. In the fall, they do build up their fat stores to prepare for winter. And in winter, they usually go into a torpor, but they can still be aroused from that. And they become less active with less feeding, but they may be active in winter. So don't be surprised if you see one in the snow. And access to food is probably the biggest driver of activity in the winter. So if there's food available, they're up and about. And they become more active during breeding season, which is usually from February to April. So here's a game cam that's showing a skunk that's out walking in winter. And again, you can probably actually see them better in winter because their black fur shows up against the white snow. So don't be surprised if you see them. Porcupines are also active all winter long. They often stay out of their dens, or I'm sorry, they often stay in their dens when it's particularly cold or stormy. And they like to den in crevices and rocks or in hollow logs or trees. And they find any little nook that's easy to access. And because they have very short legs, they can't navigate very well in deep snow. So they don't wander very far from their dens in the winter. And they eat mostly bark and branches from nearby trees in winter. And those are of fairly limited nutritional value. So they tend to lose a lot of weight, maybe up to about a third of their weight during winter. And once again, porcupines live in dens that are often in a cave, a crevice, or hollow tree. And the hallmark of a porcupine den is that there's lots of scat outside the entrance. And again, once the snow starts in winter, sometimes they just come outside the den to defecate and then go right back in. So again, here you see a classic example of a porcupine den in the hollow of a tree, and it's just loaded with scat outside. So again, large piles of scat, very characteristic of a porcupine den. And here's what porcupine dens look like, porcupine tracks look like in the snow. Again, they have kind of a waddling gait and they go side to side. And here you can actually see the tail. So again, it's very characteristic. Once again, porcupines don't like deep snow because they have very short legs. So they usually stay in when there's lots of deep snow. Opossums in the winter have a very tough time. Winter's very tough on them. They don't hibernate and they don't store up fat like other mammals do. And the biggest problem is that they don't have any fur on their ears or their toes or their long tails. And that makes them particularly those sites particularly vulnerable to frostbite in the cold. And in fact, opossums often have their tails amputated by the cold. And when it's really cold, they may nest in a hollow log or an abandoned burrow and stay there for several days at a time. How about beavers? Well, we've talked a lot about beavers. The temperature inside a beaver lodge typically is about 32 degrees, and it's usually maintained because it's well insulated by mud, snow cover, and also the beavers have huddled together and their bodies are radiating heat. So that helps maintain that temperature inside the lodge at 32 degrees. Beavers also store fat in their tail, and they will utilize that fat over the winter. And adult beavers do reduce their metabolic rate in winter. Usually the young beavers don't do that. Uh, we've talked before, there's typically a pile of sticks that's underwater at the base of the lodge, and that serves as a food store for the winter. So the adults will often retrieve those sticks for the young to feed on. And the beavers are sleeping together in the upper level of the lodge for warmth. As we mentioned before, sometimes they'll even let a muskrat in to help generate some heat. So as a result, a beaver that's single usually doesn't do as well in winter as a beaver that's still with his family because you got nobody to huddle with. Beaver fur is also thicker in winter, and they spread oil from their anal glands onto their fur, and this makes their fur waterproof. And if there's some open water, they may venture out in order to eat some trees. This is showing a typical beaver lodge. Once again, you see multiple entrances underwater. You see this cache of sticks at the base of the lodge. They're going to use that for feeding during the winter. The lodge typically has several levels. And this one level down here, they'll dry off and they may eat there. And then the upper level they'll use for sleeping and mating. So again, at least two entrances under the surface and two tiers above the water. Again, the lower tier for feeding and basically drip drying, and the upper tier is their sleeping chamber. And again, that cache of sticks below the water line is used as a food source throughout the winter. As we mentioned, the temperature inside that lodge is typically maintained at about 32 degrees because it's so well insulated. And there are two types of beaver lodge. There's the open water lodge and the bank lodge or bank den. And the bank dens tend to be cooler than the open water lodges. And here you see a typical lodge, and you actually see some steam, a mist rising above them. That's from the beavers inside breathing. Um, Beavers also create canal systems. Here they've created a dam in one of the polishing ponds at Eastman. Uh, but these canals that they dig allow them to swim up to the side of a forest and be able to cut down a tree and drag it back to their dam or lodge without being eaten by a predator. And sometimes they can also do this under the ice. So again, this is, remember I just showed you a beaver lodge on one of the polishing ponds. When the adjacent polishing pond here at Eastman, we saw this interesting pattern. Under the ice, there's this long line that's coming through. And we actually suspected that this was the beavers swimming under the ice. They'd go all the way over here. They would collect some wood and bring them back to the where they had just built a lodge. And in fact, in the spring, once the ice had melted, we pretty much confirmed that over here there was an area where the beavers were climbing out. How about otters in winter? Well, otters are semi-aquatic mammals, and they usually find a den close to the open water, like an abandoned beaver lodge. But they have other options like burrows or any nooks or crannies or even under fallen logs. And they still like the water and they'll swim in very icy water. They have a specialized coat that has two layers of fur, one of which is essentially waterproof. And they still rely on aquatic sources of food like crayfish, amphibians, reptiles, fish. But they may eat rabbits if they can't find any aquatic food sources. And they really love to play, and sliding is one of their favorite pastimes. So here's a video of otters sliding. Pretty amazing. Here's an otter slide at Frog Pond here at Eastman. Here's another otter slide you can see down here. And there are very few things that can mimic an otter slide. I suppose you could have uh, kids sledding on a hill with saucers that might do this, but in fact, these typically have footprints that are within the line. Okay, otter tracks are defined by slightly slanted foot prints, and again, you may see the tail dragging here. We mentioned before weasels in winter. The weasel's coat turns white in winter. That helps hide them from prey and from predators. And they commonly den in the burrow of another animal in winter. Often they'll line their nests with fur or the skin of a rodent that they preyed upon. And they often cache some prey that they haven't yet consumed in their dens, and then they return to it later. And they don't bulk up for the winter, so they stay very active in winter. And they actually have to stay skinny so they can fit into some burrows of some of that smaller prey. And because they have a very high metabolism, they have to forage a lot in winter. And they actually eat about 40% of their body weight daily in winter. And they still eat primarily small mammals like mice and voles, but they can also prey upon large animals that are larger than themselves, like rabbits. And again, this is just showing some weasel prints that you might see in the snow. Weasels do have a bounding gait, so often you'll see this type of pattern. Fishers are also active. There are fishers at Eastman. Here's one on a game camp. And fishers are active year round. And whereas most of the year they tend to hunt at night, in winter they tend to hunt more in the daytime. So we may actually be able to see them more likely in the winter. And unlike the weasel, the fisher's coat doesn't turn white in winter. It stays dark, actually becomes darker and glossier in winter. And they have relatively big feet that help them move on the snowpacks. And in winter, they may use tree cavities, but they're more likely to take shelter at ground level in something like a hollow log or the space under a rock or in a root pile or a brush pile. And they tend to leave their scat near the mouth of these dens, somewhat like the porcupines do. And these ground level winter dens or rest sites are often easiest to find when you have deep snow. And these snow dens consist of tunnels that may lead to an intranivian or subnivian chamber. Remember, subnivian means the space that's underneath the snow. Intranivian means the space inside the snow. So we're going to show you a video here. Notice how those big paws help them walk on the snow. Here the veers are sent in. And once again, kind of a bounding gait. Very easy to walk on top of the snow because of those big paws. And they're very curious. Okay, Fisher tracks. What I want to show you, Ed Sheeran, uh, who's one of the rangers at the National Park Service at Marsh Billions, it does an incredible video on tracking patterns, and he highlights the fisher in many of those. Here at Fisher, you can actually tell from the track pattern what the animal was likely doing. So here you see Fisher tracks. So here the fisher probably came up, took a drink out of this pond, and then went off. Here, there are two types of fisher tracks. The larger ones are from a male fisher. These are the male fisher. The smaller ones are probably from a female fisher. So Ed Sheeran has put together what likely happened here. The female fisher was probably wandering back and forth, and she stopped here. And she's probably sniffing at the scent left by a larger male. Okay, remember there are some scent glands that are in the feet of the fishers, and that's actually what she's doing. And again, this was taken in late February, early March, which happens to be their mating season. Raccoons are also active year-round in winter, but we'll probably see fewer of them. When it gets really cold, they tend to enter a dormant state, merely torpor, and they reduce their metabolism, and they'll sleep in their dens for a few weeks at a time. They do store body fat in preparation for winter. And again, they like to den in tree hollows or rock crevices. And they may also use burrows that were dug by other mammals, or they'll stay in dense underbrush or in tree crotches. And they may den in riverbanks or abandoned beaver lodges. And they may seek shelter in your house or your property structures when it gets really cold. A lot of people have complained about raccoons in their houses, and they'll still raid your trash cans in winter. So they're very clever mammals. And this is just showing what raccoon tracks would look like in the snow. How about deer in winter? Well, deer grow a thick hollow coat that's dark brown or gray, and it absorbs more heat, which helps insulate them from cold and repels the water. And the coat traps air, which helps insulate them. And their skin secretes an oily substance that actually makes their fur more water repellent. And deer do become less active and eat less in the winter, so they have to reduce their metabolism. And they'll eat twigs and stems and grasses and other plants that are available. And they'll also eat nut fruits and mushrooms if they're available. Much of what they browse is above the snow. And they will seek shelter from the wind and cold in thickets or under evergreen trees or other dense stands of trees that can intercept the snow. So particularly eastern hemlocks are very good at intercepting the snow. So you'll often see them hanging out where there are a lot of eastern hemlocks. And they also tend to group together in things called yards. We talked about guard hairs before. Well, again, the guard hairs are in the outer coat of the deer, and the guard hairs of summer are replaced by these longer, kinkier guard hairs in winter. And these guard hairs are often hollow and they're filled with air, and that provides insulation. It would also produce some degree of buoyancy if they happen to go in the water. And here's showing a massive deer yard. Like I said, they may congregate together in winter to kind of conserve heat and also to provide some protection from predators. They often will find a slope that faces south, so they're getting more sunlight, which also helps them become warm. Um, And these deer yards may be in fields or thickets where there's some food available, but they also need some ample cover from evergreen trees like hemlocks. And the tree cover reduces the need for them to walk in snow, which actually takes up a lot of energy. So once again, these deer yards tend to be on south-facing slopes, and that helps protect them from deep snow and colder temperatures and some northerly winds. And the yarding like this conserves body heat and energy and also discourages predators. Many deer yards are just a few acres, but some could be as large as 100 acres. And generations of deer often return to that same yard. This is showing a much more typical deer yard that you might see here at Eastman. And again, what I want to point out here is that the hemlocks or other fir trees are often very good at intercepting the snow, so they make ideal habitat for the deer to hang out in winter. This is showing a deer bed in the snow. The deer is lied there. And this is showing deer tracks in the snow. And sometimes the pattern may tell you what the deer was actually doing. The deer can either walk or trot or gallop. So the pattern of deer tracks may vary with whatever activity they were doing. You may see deer scat. Again, the deer scat in the snow, which is here on the left, compared to the larger moose scat on the right. And again, deer scat in the winter. I don't like this picture because I would never recommend to anybody that you touch any sort of scat with your bare hands. But again, this is illustrating that the scat of deer in the wintertime almost looks like sawdust. And that's because it reflects their diet, which in the winter consists mostly of woody plants. So how about their bigger relative, the moose? Well, moose stay active all winter, and they do reduce their activity. And we mentioned before that whereas a moose in the summer might have a range of 25 square miles or more, in the winter they may reduce that range to less than a square mile. And because the food is less abundant, they're going to lose some weight over the winter, even if they don't get infested by winter ticks. They'll survive the winter by eating whatever is available. That may be moss, lichens, sticks, barks. And they have several features that help them get through the winter. Their long legs allow them to walk through even deep snow. Their hooves and their dew claws help them walk on top of the snow. And their long nose actually warms the air before it reaches their lungs. So again, not many people think about the benefits of having a long nose. And they have very thick fur that helps keep them warm, and it's got those hollow guard hairs that provides good insulation. But unfortunately, winter ticks, which are one of the biggest causes of moose mortality, also like to live in that fur. So again, moose are ungulates. They have hooves, and note the big dew claws here. These are dew claws back here. And when there's deep, soft snow or mud, these dew claws may actually touch the ground and their hooves may splay. And that combination actually increases the surface area of the feet and helps support the moose's weight. It actually acts kind of like snowshoes and prevents the moose from sinking in the snow. So those big hooves also acts like paddles when the moose are swimming. So again, moose are really made for snow. They have these long legs which help them walk through deep snow. And in the very deep snow or mud, we mentioned those dew claws touch the ground and their hooves splay and then help support their weight. And again, like I said, it almost acts like snowshoes. So again, this is moose tracks in the snow. Here the hooves are clearly showing. And in the top one, you see a nice mark left by that large dew claw. But the dew claws often don't show. And this is showing moose tracks down here without the dew claw showing. Remember I showed you a deer bed. Well, this is a moose bed. So it's bigger than a deer bed, but it has something else. It has blood tinged. And that's because, again, in the winter, the moose gets infested with winter ticks. And those winter ticks actually cause an incredible amount of bleeding of the moose. So here, this was a moose that was infested with winter ticks, and you're seeing blood in this basically moose bed in the snow. Well, how about birds? Again, about 85% of the birds in New Hampshire do migrate south to some degree. But we still have lots of birds with us here at Eastman throughout the winter. And some of what we call resident species include woodpeckers, owls, titmice, cardinals, grouse, crows, blue jays, nuthatches, sparrows, barred owls, wild turkeys. Here's a barred owl. Uh, Owls do remain active in winter. They also breed in winter. So you actually may be more likely to hear them during winter because they hoot quite a bit when they're breeding. Because they have such keen hearing, they can often hear their prey under the snow. And their feet are covered with very downy feathers that go all the way down to the tips of their toes. And that helps keep their feet warm even when it's really cold out. And you might also be lucky enough in winters to see a snowy owl. Usually they're not seen in New Hampshire in other seasons, but what we call eruptions of snowy owls, which are an Arctic species, would happen when the abundance of food or their usual prey is not as high in some of the more northern climates. So that's what a snowy owl would look like. You may be lucky enough to see one in the winter, but you may see some signs of owl activity. Okay, here, some little critter wasn't so lucky, but that owl was probably quite happy. So you see this perfect imprint of the wings of an owl in a fresh fallen snow, and it's right above this little hole where a small rodent was likely sticking its head out, and that owl preyed upon him. So obviously, it was a small mammal that was in that hole. And it's not just owls that leave wing prints in the winter. This wing imprint was actually left by a ruffed grouse. Climate change is impacting the owls, but in ways that are not always clear. You'd expect that the shorter winters and less snow cover would make the prey easier for them to catch. In recent years, we've seen this problematic cycle. We get a snowfall that's followed by rain. So we end up with a crusty ice cover over the snow. And the owls may have difficulty catching mice and voles under that ice cover. And sometimes, if we get a really big dump of snow, it makes it difficult for the owls to hunt. Unlike the fox, which I showed you, which can go down 3 feet to capture a mouse, it's very difficult for an owl to get down that deep. So in a very snowy winter that we had back in 2007 to 2008, there were hundreds of dead owls that were found. And they were often hit by motor vehicle accidents because they were out hunting along the plowed edges of roads where it was easier to find prey. And back at that time, they were also seen during the daytime, which typically is a sign that they have very little food out there. Turkeys are available, active during winter. Here you see a group of turkeys. It's interesting that these groups of turkeys are usually all same sex. So these are probably male turkeys that are out there. They are still around in winter, and they tend to huddle in dense conifer areas or dense bushes, which help protect them from the wind. And they, like the deer, will favor south-facing slopes so they get more sunlight. They like to roost in trees so they're up off the ground, so they're less vulnerable to predators like coyotes. And they do tend to huddle in groups with birds of the same sex, and they'll fluff up their feathers to capture air for insulation. And they prefer soft mast, things like crab apples and wild plums, but they can eat hard mast like acorns and beech nuts. And their beaks actually allow them to eat pine seeds from inside pine cones. And it may be hard for them to find food under the snow cover. So they may lose up to 40% of their body weight in the winter, but they can survive up to 2 weeks without food if they're otherwise healthy. But many do die during the winter. In a particularly severe winter, the survival rate of the wild turkeys may be as low as 55 to 60%. And turkey tracks in the snow are fairly easy to see. Again, they have 3 toes that point forward and a fourth one which goes backward. Crows are with us year round. Some consider them to be pests, but they do help clean up roadkill. And if you hear many crows begin cawing, it's often a sign that there's another animal nearby. On several occasions, I've heard the crows making lots of noise, and I look out and I'll find a bobcat. How about eagles in winter? Well, eagles have lots of feathers, over 7,000 feathers that help them survive the winter. They have a waterproof outer layer, and they'll preen that with oil from a special gland. And they have an inner downy layer that traps air that provides some insulation. And they can even fluff those feathers up for more insulation, and they'll sometimes tuck their heads inside those feathers. They do often have communal roosting. They roost together to conserve heat. And they have a special protein in their blood that actually acts like an antifreeze. And they can stand on frozen surfaces because they have that countercurrent vascular heat exchange system. Remember, I mentioned that before. So it cools the blood that's going down to their feet so their feet don't freeze and get stuck on whatever they're standing on, but it also warms the blood that's returning from their feet to help keep them warm. And they'll increase their fat reserves in fall, and that provides both some energy source and insulation. And while many animals actually reduce their metabolic rate in winter, eagles actually increase their metabolic rate by about 15%, and that actually generates some heat. And their caloric needs are reduced by less activity and roosting in the winter, but they may consume up to 50% more calories in winter to generate more heat. And they do change their diet from primarily fish and waterfowl I'm sorry, from fish in the summer to waterfowl or small mammals in the winter. And some eagles migrate, but most don't. Uh, so again, this eagle is going to survive the winter, but those loons that are trapped in the ice won't. Basically, that eagle is just standing by, waiting patiently, and he's going to prey upon those loons. We haven't talked much about insects in winter. Again, most insects burrow into the ground or have a nest. Some even migrate. Actually, dragonflies migrate south. But ticks are still a concern in winter. Ticks are not killed by the cold, and instead they just become less active. So it's still possible for you to get bitten by a tick even in winter. And the ticks burrow down into the leaf litter. And only when it's below freezing can you be sure that you're going to be safe from ticks. Climate change has had an impact on tick populations and tick-borne diseases. Here in New England, because our winters are becoming much milder and they have less snow cover, ticks are more active both earlier and later in the year. And of course, the winter ticks that we talked about find the warmest places of all. That's the coat of a moose. Lastly, the subnivean zone. This is the zone that's beneath the snow and above the ground. And yes, there's actually a space down there. The snow layer provides insulation, and it keeps the subnivean layer's temperature around 32 degrees, even when the outside air temperature drops below zero. And moles, voles, and shrews live in the subnivean zone in the winter. And the moles and voles build tunnels in the snow so they can bring some air in. They can climb out to feed on grass or whatever plants are above the snow. And the tunnels also prevent harmful carbon dioxide buildup. And they usually have multiple exits to be able to escape predators or flooding when the snow actually melts. And shrews eat mostly insects and eggs beneath the snow. Um, Owls and foxes use their keen sense of hearing to be able to detect prey beneath the snow. Remember, we showed you that incredible video of the fox, basically leaping and diving 3 feet deep into the snow to capture a small mammal. Weasels also use their keen sense of smell to be able to detect prey in the subnivean zone. And because the weasels have very narrow bodies, they can actually go into the tunnels and enter the subnivean zone to capture either mice or voles. So this is a diagram, courtesy of Adelaide Tyrol, that's nicely showing the subnivean zone. So basically, there's a space underneath the snowpack. Many people don't realize how that can exist there. But what happens is that the snow is actually held up a few inches by either rocks, stumps, logs, bent plants that act like little umbrellas. And it creates this basement-like crawl space that's underneath the snowpack. So it's actually between the ground and the snow. And what happens is that the snow down here will melt and some vapor will go upward, and that actually turns into ice at the bottom of the snowpack. So they have this really deep little zone underneath. And in that snowpack, the mice, voles, and shrews are living and moving about in little tunnels. And this nicely shows there was a recent thaw, and it shows the extensive tunnel systems that the mice and voles had created underneath the snow. But life in the subnivean zone is not all that great. It's not safe for everybody. So again, here on the top, you see a great gray owl that caught a mouse. On the bottom, you see a weasel that caught a vole. And we showed you that nice video of the fox diving into the snow to catch a mouse. So again, you may see some of those small critters do leave some tracks on top of the snow. This is left by a white-footed mouse, and it creates what's called a zipper pattern. And if you look closely here, you see the kind of a bounding pattern at the feet of the mouse, but he's dragging his tail in between. So it creates what actually looks like a zipper. The Metavol tracks are a little bit different. They have kind of a trotting or an alternate pattern, and you may also see this tunnel that's left. And again, shrews tend to move in much more erratic ways, so they leave these coiling tracks that they're going all up and down here. So again, we mentioned before, fresh snowfall is a great time for you to get out there and look for animal tracks, whether you're hiking or cross-country skiing or just looking out your window. And keep in mind that the tracks may get distorted in the snow, but the tracks that you're most likely to see here at Eastman in the snow are from dogs, but also from rabbits and hares and squirrels. But you may also see tracks of some larger animals as well. And if you want to learn more about animal tracking in the winter, recommend that you go to the National Park Service workshops. They have a YouTube channel. There's the link to that. And I mentioned Ed Sheeran, who's one of the rangers at the National Park Service at Marsh Billings. And you can look at his excellent video footage, which showed some of those track patterns, such as the fissure that we showed you. And the John Hay Estate at the Fells usually has an annual animal tracking session once there's a snowfall. And also in the last few years, the Marsh Billings National Park Service has also had a animal tracking session in the winter. So there's some great opportunities out there for you. So that's a little bit about winter and its effect on wildlife. And there's plenty of wildlife that's still available in the winter. So again, great time to get out there. And hopefully this helped you learn a little bit about the winter.